Hi, everybody. Sorry for a couple of technical glitches. Welcome to the latest in the One Israel Fund series of webinars. My name is Eve Harow, tour guide and podcaster, and also the Director of Tourism and Community Projects and Development for One Israel Fund. For those of you who don't know, One Israel Fund is the premier organization for the communities in Judea and Samaria, playgrounds, sports centers, what have you, a lot of security, parks, old age homes, and new mothers, community centers, filling in the gaps, filling in the needs for the people living in the communities in Judea and Samaria. And I'm very honored to have with us tonight, connecting to One Israel Fund, it's tonight in Israel, it's 7 o'clock here in Israel, which is where we both are, Dr. Yechiel Leiter, whose CV is so extensive, I'm happy to send it to you, but you have to make sure you have enough room on your computer. He has been involved with virtually everything from Israeli politics to working in the ministries, the private sector, academia, think tanks, and we're gonna just touch on some of that tonight via the conversation that we're gonna have with him about the sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, the Abraham Accords, and where we go from there. But he is also, what many people don't know, one of the founders of One Israel Fund. So Yechiel, thanks so much for joining us today on, today being October 22nd, 2020, the year that it's just doesn't seem like it's going to end. But we've moved into the Jewish New Year and we're already in the 5th day of Cheshvan, 5781. So thanks so much for joining us here on One Israel Fund, your kind of old stomping grounds, I guess, from way back when. You hear me? I don't hear you. I don't hear you.
No, do you hear me now?
Now we hear you. Okay, great.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I minimized a lot of it, but in the interest of time. Since you're the founder of One Israel Fund, I'd actually like to take a minute before we get into the topic of tonight and to ask you why One Israel Fund was founded, what is happening in the 90s, because that does connect to where we are today. Many of us either didn't know, weren't involved, don't remember what is going on in Judea and Samaria way back when. And so if you could fill that in from some of your vast experiences, I mentioned in so many different spheres, and why there was a need to even establish this organization in the early to mid 90s.
Wow, you take me back a long time. I thought we were going to focus on the present. I just finished a conference on the Abraham Accords.
We'll get to it.
What's that?
We'll get to it. I'm just taking advantage of the fact that you can give us a perspective that a lot of people don't have on
it really is. I think it's a great way to start our discussion. The truth is that it's amazing what's transpired in the past 30 years. We established the One Israel Fund in the early 90s, but really we have to go back to the late 80s to get a take on why. The question is why we had to establish the One Israel Fund. In the 80s, I was living in Hebron. I was the director of the community there for a while, from about 88 to 92. And prior to that, there were tremendous needs, obviously, in the Jewish community of Hebron. And I was asked by the leadership at the time to take a fund that had been created, the Hebron Fund, and get it started. And I met at the time with many federation leaders and tried to convince them that the Jews of Judea and Samaria shouldn't be boycotted. And I found myself, representing Judea and Samaria, even though I was really talking about the Jewish community of Hebron. There had been a number of very important funds that had gotten off the ground. The Shiloh Fund, Ira Rappaport had been working, of course, Ketzela and Beit El. I mean, we're going back a few years, but there were some initial efforts to get funding for the growing Jewish communities in Yehuda and Shomron. But I realized that I was I was not getting through to the Federation leadership, and it just wasn't going to happen. So when I moved from Hebron to the Yesha Council in '92, the Yesha Council took a decision right then and there that we would establish a fund that would be for all of Judea and Samaria. That was going to be the uniqueness of the One Israel Fund, and it went through a number of stages and iterations. We started with some other funds until we got it actually off the ground. We had to get the paperwork done, and I had some wonderful people, who joined me. Steve Orlau and Jay Kestenbaum and a whole bunch of old friends. And the biggest, I'd say the biggest, our crucible, our big test was to get people to understand. It was really the Hasbara angle of things, because we had to get people understand that this wasn't something that was going away, that we were a permanent presence in Judea and Samaria. And at the time we weren't, close to 500,000 as we are today. We were tens of thousands, and then over 100,000. I remember that big milestone, we went over 100,000. So people had to be convinced that this was something that was, permanent, that it was legitimate. I remember, if you permit me a short anecdote, just to give you a flavor of what it was like there at the early 90s. We opened our first office together with the Jerusalem Reclamation Project on 7th Avenue and 34th Street. We didn't have any funds at the time, so they were kind enough to take us in. And it was just prior to the Ateret Kohanim dinner. They used to have, huge dinners. And I met in the office for the first time their honoree, which was Joe Mermelstein of blessed memory, a very, very, very dear friend. And when he asked me, we met for the first time in the office, and it was a couple of evenings before the dinner. And he said, what are you doing here? You're like, who are you? And I told him about Yesha, and he said, focus on Jerusalem. And in the end, a couple of days later, he came back to me and said, I get it. I explained it to him, and he said, I get it. And he became one of our biggest supporters, one of our best friends. And he went on to become an honoree of One Israel Fund. Right. So that's what it was like at the time. Even very, very committed Jews to the idea of Yehuda Shomron needed to be convinced that the One Israel Fund was the place to be. And I think we managed to get it off the ground and ultimately prove that to be the case.
Yeah, you used to go around with Ariel Sharon too. I remember.
Well, those were, yeah. Well, you're bringing back very fond memories. Yeah. Those were very, very heady days. Those were the days of Oslo. We were pariahs. We were outcasts. We were the obstacles to peace.
That's right.
And that was another, big test we had to explain to people that it wasn't going to work, that Oslo wasn't going to work, and that they needed to support the Jews of Yehuda Shomron in order to create a real peace for the future, with Jewish rights and with security for the state of Israel, and peace through strength, as we're now achieving, hopefully, with the Abraham Accords. But yes, Sharon was an interesting constellation. Bibi Netanyahu had won the internal battle in the Likud for the chairmanship of the Likud, and Ariel Sharon, may rest in peace, was kind of shunted to the side and made himself available. And I can tell you that, he was a workhorse. We traversed the United States repeatedly, again and again. It was like Tuesday, it must be Belgium. That's what it was like. Every day we were in a different city, and we worked from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m., going from, federation meetings and parlor meetings and meetings with the editorial boards of the local newspapers and Jewish leadership and college campuses. It was a schedule from 7 a.m. right through the night. And he was a real workhorse. He was ready to do it. And to a very large extent, he deserves credit for helping us get it off the ground. Sure. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Which makes, of course, the ironies of what happened a decade later with Gush Katif when he's prime minister, all that much more hurtful. But I want to thank you for taking a few minutes to give the background here, because Judea and Samaria is virtually in the headlines almost every single day, to the point where the discussion that we're having tonight of Israel having peace accords or normalization with countries around us, the question of Judea and Samaria and applying sovereignty to Judea and Samaria is even a part of the issue. And to take us back now close to 30 years, 25, 27, 28 years, this didn't just happen. The Judea and Samaria and the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria are literally facts on the ground. It happened because a lot of people, both within and without Israel, tilted at those windmills and said, this is not just going to be a few people like on a hilltops or one day going to be taken off. If we invest in the people and in the communities, we can make this stay. And so the reason that we're sitting here, one of the big reasons we're sitting here in 2020, and that this is an issue, and we've got a couple hundred people watching this webinar and a lot of discussion, there's different conferences going on today, that this is really an important topic, is because of what was done in the 90s and all through the intervening decades, dollar by dollar, shekel by shekel, swing and slide and camera by camera, in order to make sure that the presence of the Jews in Judea and Samaria is irreversible. And I think that needs to be noted, because we didn't just get where we are today by anybody's good graces. It was a lot of hard work. It was a lot of faith, and of people, some who are with us and some who are not. So I want to thank you, first of all, for putting yourself there and using your connections and whatever you could at the time. And here we are today, millions and millions of dollars later, and strong communities later, really on the ground to stay. So getting to the topic of tonight's webinar, what is your feeling? We've got some questions that people sent in. We can start off with one of the questions that someone has sent in. Yes, sovereignty is important in Judea and Samaria. We're looking around, we're watching the Arabs build willy-nilly in Area C, and we don't. Those of us who live, you live in Eli, I live in Gush Etzion. We don't really live in a country. A lot of the laws here are a mishmash of laws that don't make any sense, that aren't helping anyone, not Jews or Arabs. Is that this issue of sovereignty here, was it worth, I'll put it bluntly, in your mind, was signing these accords and kicking this can down the road for who knows how long, of applying sovereignty in Judea and Samaria? Do you think this was the wisest decision to make?
Yes, I do. And I actually think that the peace accords are going to, in the long run, enable us to apply sovereignty rather than prevent us from doing so. First of all, let me connect to what you said at the beginning of your remarks. This is a story of prescience and perseverance. You first need the vision. You know what to persevere about. But if you have the vision and don't persevere, it doesn't work either. And the story of rebuilding Israel's heartland is a story of prescience and perseverance, because we had the vision. We knew what we had to do, but it was a matter of really persevering. It was, hear people on the ground persevering despite, the intifadas we went through. They were very difficult times. As long as we're going back to the, late 80s and early 90s. So, we had the first intifada. At that time, it was, I was in Hebron. It was a most difficult time.
Yes.
And then the second intifada, which was obviously far more violent and horrific, and the death toll was immense. But look what's transpired over this time. And not only have we moved from tens of thousands to 500,000, but the opinion of the Israeli populace has undergone a tremendous metamorphosis. I mean, everybody jokes about the 3 elections we had over the past year, and the weakening fabric of democracy. But what's really truly amazing about the election cycle is, think about it. We had 3 election cycles, and there was no serious party that was demanding unilateral concessions to the Palestinians. And think back about the 80s and the conflict between Shamir and Peres, the conflicts between Netanyahu and Peres, and the Rabin government, and everything we went through throughout those years. And there was always a sizable half of the population. Sometimes it was 45%, sometimes it was 55%, but it was a sizable part of the population which said, look, we've got to go back more or less to 67 in one way or another. And there's been a wind change in that regard. I mean, even if you take the Blue and White Party, they didn't say in any of the three cycles, we have to go back to the Oslo process. We have to go back to unilateral withdrawals, because the public just doesn't want to hear it. And just look where Labor Party is. What is it, 6 mandates? The Meretz Party is 3 mandates.
Right.
So collectively, they don't reach the number of the Arab mandates in the Knesset. So, that also has a lot to do with the perseverance of the Yesha movement, because had we not held out, that dramatic change, that tsunami of intellectual metamorphosis wouldn't have happened either. So it's a very encouraging time. As far as the Abraham Accords, I really recommend to all of the many listeners on the webinar this evening, if you haven't listened to the conference we just had, the international conference online, which ended this evening, get a hold of the tape and listen carefully, not to my speech, but to the Arab participants from Egypt and from Bahrain and from the Emirates and from Jordan and from Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And basically what they're saying is, and you got to listen closely to the music, because, I wasn't sure I would hear this music in my lifetime. But, they're saying, look, Palestinians, yeah, they might have a claim, but it's not ours. And we're not going to be held hostage anymore to the Palestinian cause. Egypt has a own nationalism. It has its own national causes. There was one representative there. He said, we had trouble in the Sinai during the Obama administration with ISIS.
Right.
He says, we know who came to our assistance. It wasn't anybody but Israel. So why do we have Israel came to the assistance of Egypt to fight ISIS? When the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis look over their shoulder today and they see the terrorism that Iran is exporting to their countries, they're being threatened. One other thing that they emphasized was Turkey. Many of them are more concerned about Turkey's support for the Muslim Brotherhood than even they are concerned about Iran. And they said, look, Israel is the country we need most to have its support, even more than the United States today. And not because they go to the United States through Israel, but because we're here. We're here. And it's a visceral and vital cause for us, just as it is for them. So I think we've got to listen to the music, and we've got to appreciate the fact that, getting back to a minute, and sorry for the long-winded answer, but it's a very long-winded subject. The issue of
you could
sovereignty.
send the link, the conference that you just mentioned that just happened. If you can get it to me, and we'll include it in the email that we send out about this webinar. We send out the tape.
Sure, we'll do that. We'll do that. But what I want to emphasize is the issue of sovereignty. Let's pay close attention. Eve, you've been at this for many, many years, and you've been commenting and you've been hosting people here, and you know the ropes. Do you remember any time in the past, I don't know, since 1967, where sovereignty was debated and discussed and formally promised by a prime minister as it was over the past year? No. It's become as household a conversation in the country, a very realistic one, as much as, I don't know, Maccabi Tel Aviv. So we've come a very, very long way. And if it takes a little bit longer to actually implement it, and implement it right, then it is absolutely worth it. Israel is going to be stronger because of this relationship with the Gulf states, with the division in the Arab world between the Muslim extremists and those who want an entente, a formal entente with Israel. they've come out of the woodwork. Let's pay attention to that. They've come out of the woodwork. They're willing to say openly, we want to dance a tango with you. And I'll add one more point before I give the microphone back to you. Listen closely also to the interviews in this conference with Ambassador David Friedman and Trump's advisor to the Middle East, President Trump's advisor, Avi Berkowitz. Both emphasized we have not. The United States has not changed its policy vis-a-vis the Trump plan and support for sovereignty. It has been put in abeyance. It has not been canceled, and they unrehearsed, they emphasize that point, and I think that's of tremendous importance.
So you said something very intriguing a few minutes ago, that you think that actually these agreements are going to make it easier for us to apply sovereignty rather than push it off, because some people reading the agreements, and it's a concern, it looks like it's either or. That these agreements mean that Israel, maybe in some secret paragraph or whatever it is, has agreed to not apply sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. You think that that's true?
No. It clearly the commitment, as Ambassador Friedman and Mr. Berkowitz emphasized, it's been delayed, not postponed, not canceled, but postponed. Mm-hmm. And if we are able to do it as a stronger internationally, then it is absolutely worthwhile. Because, if we were to go ahead and then we'd be compromised internationally, and there would be tremendous degree of pressure, and then we'd have to start walking it back, as sometimes was done in the past with certain issues, and it happens in the realm of realpolitik. That would have been counterproductive. Mm-hmm. We will be able to do it when we have a solidified position in the Middle East, where the voices that we heard in this conference saying that we're not going to be held hostage to the Palestinians will actually grow and will be formal parlance in every international meeting. Then we're going to be able to implement the sovereignty in a much stronger, and much more affordable, and much more permanent way. So yes, I think this is going to undoubtedly, in my mind, support the ultimate sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and not cancel it at all. And I just want to remind everyone that the opposition to implementing sovereignty, as it was advocated in the Trump Accords and by the Netanyahu government, was opposed by the ideological and, I would say, more dogmatic wing of the settlement movement.
Yes.
So you excuse me for that, but that is my opinion.
No, that's fine. I was actually pretty upset with some of the leaders of the Jewish communities here, who I felt were torpedoing what was a very important step to take. It was far from perfect, but it was.
No, it's far from perfect, but 50% of Area C, which is a full 30%. I mean, we have to remember, Eve, and I don't think anybody remembers it better than you do. I remember you on the hilltops of the demonstrations and the Oslo Accords. I mean, we met there on the Zayat before there was a single house on the Zayat. I don't know if you remember that, but yes, I don't know. I was dragged away by the cops. I don't know about you. I think they were scared of you.
I was black and blue for 2 weeks. It's fine.
Yeah.
When I write my book, I'll put all that in there.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
But listen, until this year, what was international parlance about the future of Judea and Samaria? It was the Barak plan and the Omer plan, and we were talking about what is going to be 3% or 5% that's going to be left to us. I know how many of the settlements will be left of the Jewish communities. Mm-hmm. And now we're talking about, the ambassador of the United States to Israel saying that he believes, and this administration believes, that all of Israel's Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria must remain. Now, that's like, that's a leap over the Tigris and the Euphrates. I mean, that's just a huge advance in Jewish destiny. So
since you mentioned this American administration, and in a couple of weeks' time, There's going to be, of course, American elections. Do you think if this administration continues more or less, then I'm assuming they'll stay with the same policies and continue doing what they're doing. But if the administration of the United States changes, how do you think that's going to affect what Israel is now doing here?
How is it going to affect? It's going to affect the world. I cry for America. I know I'll probably anger some of the listeners, but I don't think that what America is experiencing right now is going away anytime too soon. This is a cultural revolution. I've been noticing this and talking about it for years, but you mentioned before, teach on occasion, and I meet with students who go through the higher educational system in the United States, and the subtle brainwashing of America's the new generation, the young generation, the first voting generation, the second voting generation, is not a problem with anti-Israel or anti-Zionism. It's a problem of anti-Americanism. And if America weakens itself domestically, it's going to be weakened internationally. And that, it's not just a matter for Israel to confront. It's a sad statement of affairs in the world. So I am very, very concerned. Obviously we're dealing with a presidential candidate on the Democratic side who is, at best a front and at worst a Trojan horse for the extreme left in United States politics. And you're going to find, people who have expressed a dissatisfaction, an appalling dissatisfaction with who the United States is, and what America's founding fathers are, and what the values of America are. And that's going to reflect Israel. It's going to reflect the entire world. And I think it's going to have a deleterious effect on American Jewry. If I was an American Jew right now, I'd buy a house in Efrat.
Mine might be for sale. We need to downsize. So, but we could talk real estate afterwards. How about Europe? Europe is being pretty quiet, or maybe just the noise from the other side of the pond is drowning out the European reaction to what's happening here. Israel normalizing and flights going back and forth and delegations and kosher food and who knows what. Like there's this seismic shift happening here in the Middle East. For the people who aren't necessarily Zionists, I'm putting this very, very carefully, these must not be happy days. What do you think is happening in Europe?
Well, I think if Joe Biden gets elected, they're going to be very happy days. But I mean, look, we still need our collective head examined. I mean, after a president moved the embassy to Jerusalem, after he canceled the Iran Accords, the accords with Iran, after recognizing the rights to the Golan Heights, after recognizing the legality of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. Let's not overlook that. Okay, that is huge, because American administrations have coasted since 1978, since the Carter administration, with the idea of the illegality or semi-legality of our communities here in the heartland of Israel. And they certainly didn't defend them on the international arena as being legal and legitimate. So and yet American Jewry, after all of that, is going to vote somewhere between 70 and 80% for the same representative of a U.S. administration that signed the Iranian Accords, that not only didn't recognize the legality of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, forced the prime minister into a freeze,
right,
held his feet to the fire over that, said he's going to create daylight between the United States and Israel, and now we're going to elect his vice president. I mean, Jews really need to have their collective head examined. But, as Ben Shapiro said a few weeks ago, he says, well, they're doing it because they just don't think as Jews. And
that's probably not the priority, sadly.
No, the priority is this postmodern mindset of the religion of the left.
Mm-hmm. Whoop. Okay, I don't know what just happened.
I guess I said something that irritated someone.
I'm sure, but that's fine. If everybody agreed, it would just be quite boring. But to get back to Europe, do you think that they're just not as important on the world stage anymore?
Well,
One
what's
of,
happening?
yeah, no, just an interesting thing that happened today was Pompeo saying that some of these human rights organizations, I'm putting it in quotes, Amnesty International, et cetera, Human Rights Watch, many of whom were funded by Europeans or staffed by Europeans, are now going to be declared what many of us felt for a long time, anti-Semitic organizations. So we know that Europe has, when you live here, you see it, how much influence they have via these so-called NGOs, whether it's in Judea and Samaria, fomenting trouble with the Arabs that live here. So it might surprise a lot of people, certainly not you or myself, that there is coexistence on the ground here to a great degree between the Jews and the Arabs who actually live in Judea and Samaria. There is a great sense of normalization to, I'm not talking about, the terrorists, et cetera, which is never gonna, they're never going to change their minds. But I'm saying on a day-to-day, working together, shopping together, making sure that the roads are safe. I mean, we're all in this thing together. But there's outside forces that come in and try and disrupt. Do you think that what he said today, Pompeo, do you think that might change any of that? Or those nefarious groups are still going to be doing what they can to do the opposite of what they say they're standing for, which is peace? They actually end up making things much worse on the day-to-day level between the people living here. Because ultimately it is about us being able to live here together, no matter what pieces of paper are signed. And I know over the past few years, we've seen a growing acceptance, I think, to a great degree of some of the Arab villagers here, meeting with the mayors of our towns, doing things together, seeing that it's more worth their while to be to be part of Israel or get what Israel has to offer rather than the enmity. So do you think, do you see that trying to be changed, or you think that we're heading in a positive direction and we can overcome that?
Well, let me divide my response. As far as the day-to-day relations of Jews and Arabs in Judea and Samaria, normal relations are the norm. It's not an exception where sometimes leadership are meeting with the mayors. At any given time, at every day, you have more coexistence and cordial relations than you have the opposite. Anybody just needs to go shopping right now in Rami Levi, whether it's in Ariel or at or in Gush Etzion or in Shar Binyamin, and you have a Haredi checkout at the checkout counter next to an Arab from Ramallah, and next to somebody from a village, and next to somebody from a settlement, and everybody's shopping together and getting along together. So 24/7 there's a normal kind of stream of life, which the left never wanted to project. The reprehensible, the nefarious, they can't change their mind because it's a dogmatic religion when it comes to. I mean, you're going to see, by the way, with relation to the Abraham Accords, the same thing. They're already saying, it's not really significant. Look, just 2 weeks before the Accords were signed, former Prime Minister Barak gave an interview and said, there's never going to be peace with any Arab country until we make concessions to the Palestinians. They're never going to change their mind because they can't, because they're married to ideas that they've created. It's a kind of new form of idolatry. There's no real rational thinking about things. So, right. Which is exactly, by the way, what idolatry is. But we're not going into a theological discourse this evening. As far as Europe is concerned, what's happening in Europe is really riveting for any student of history, political science, political theory. Really fascinating, because what for years this idea of the European Union was at the forefront of this postmodern idea where there are really no more nations, there are no more peoples. Right. Every bit of enmity between peoples is a result of national identity, religious identity, and they're going to erase borders. All the differences were going to dissolve, and economies were going to be meshed, and peoples were the same. And then all of a sudden, when we had the southern tier of Europe going bankrupt, and Germans having to bail them out, very unhappy about why should they bail out the Greeks and the Spaniards and so on and so forth. But it was just, it was a trickle. And then it got more intense with Brexit, where all of a sudden, you have half the British people saying, no, what are we doing here? Why are they are we being forced by some secretaries in Brussels to take in illegal immigrants that are taking away our jobs? And they saw their unemployment rising, and they saw their GDP tanking, and they said, no, enough, Brexit. And then came COVID-19, then came Corona. And all of a sudden, there's a question about, well, maybe we're not just one big country. Maybe the continent is not just one big country. Maybe we should put our borders back. So all of a sudden, you see borders being redrawn between West and East, and even in the West. All of a sudden, the French just can't saunter on down south across the mountains into Spain. Spain's borders are closed. Italy's borders are closed. Austria's borders are closed. Suddenly there's an Austrian identity. Suddenly there's an Italian identity. So the problem that Europe had with Israel being at the apex of a nation state, I mean, there is no more nation state than Israel, right? I mean, that's what gets everybody crazy about the right of return, for example, right? We're a nation state. So without even having to say it, we're just a nation state. That's what Zionism is. So anybody who was opposed to the idea of the nation state, who saw this new postmodern world come into existence of everybody just one big happy culture, was always opposed more than to any other country than to Israel, because we are the icon of the nation state. Yeah, right. And what we've always said, what we've said in the time of Avraham Avinu, from Abraham, speaking about the Abraham Accords, is that people do have different identities and different cultures and different beliefs, and at the same time, we didn't proselytize. We didn't say everybody's got to be like us. No, people are different, and yet they can still live in peace. They can still live together. As a matter of fact, recognizing differences, just like in a family, is what keeps everybody together. Not recognizing differences and forcing identity is what tears people apart. So Europe is now going through this national rebirth and individual national rebirth. And it's difficult for them to come to Israel and say, dissolve, because if they're putting up their borders again, well, there's a nation state called Israel too. And they're also tired of the Palestinians as well. That it all comes together. There are constellations that develop in history that create dynamic into a new future. And one of the aspects of this constellation is that the corruption in the Palestinian Authority is so rampant that the Europeans too are saying, why are we funding bank accounts for Abu Mazen in Switzerland? It's an interesting thing. You have the Arabs at the conference we just had from Bahrain and the Emirates saying, there was one reporter from Saudi Arabia, as a matter of fact, who's in Abu Dhabi, and she said, what do you mean that their income, they've lost, the PA has lost its income? They have billions of dollars sitting in accounts, but they're personal accounts. So we're going to give them more money, and more of it's going to be siphoned off to the personal accounts in Luxembourg? No way. It's got to stop. So I think these voices, which are certainly increasing in Europe, in the Arab world itself, and because Trump created an atmosphere. Even if you didn't like him, but the foreign policy of the United States the past 4 years created an atmosphere. And I've got to say something about our prime minister here.
With whom you worked quite closely for.
With whom I work quite closely, yes. And I got to say something here, which is just, I don't think it's appreciated enough. When, I was in Paraguay actually when Bibi appeared at the joint session of Congress to what was in fact a denunciation of the guy down the block, the President of the United States, in a joint session of Congress. Basically, the Prime Minister of Israel came to the United States and said, the President of the United States is making a huge mistake. He shouldn't do this. Now, he didn't do this, in a Fox News interview from Jerusalem. This was in a joint session of Congress. Now, I got to tell you, somebody at the time called me and asked what my feeling was about it. And I'm sitting here, in a hotel room in Asuncion, and I said, look, this is a huge problem. You can't dress down the President of the United States in joint session of Congress. But what Bibi Netanyahu did, in effect, was call the more responsible and saner aspects of the international community and said, look, stand together on this. And you know who heard him more than anybody else? The Gulf states. The Arabs heard him. The Arabs who are threatened by Turkey or threatened by Iran or threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood or threatened by Shiite extremism, they heard him and they said, he is showing leadership. Where the United States is showing concessions and appeasement, the Prime Minister of Israel is speaking for us. They finally had a voice. And the vision and the courage that he showed at that one moment, for that alone, I mean, he's done a huge amount for Judea and Samaria, for the economy of the country, for the defense of the country, for so much more. But for that alone, for that decision, for that courageous decision alone, he's going to have a very, very special place in Jewish history. And I think that we're seeing the fruits of that vision now with this new formal and public entente with the moderate Sunni states.
So to turn our attention for a minute to the Israeli government, because we've been talking about what happens if the American administration changes. This is going to affect what's happening here vis-a-vis Israel. But what if the Israeli administration changes? Because, we could have elections again in a couple of weeks. There's no budget. Things are really a big mess here when it comes to the stability of the government. COVID has just made it worse, but there were a lot of underlying tensions there. Do you think that with a different Israeli prime minister, this whole new entente, for lack of a better word, will continue and be strengthened or not? Like, is this across the board, left and right, in the Israeli political realm, even though the left currently isn't going to say, wow, this is fantastic, because they don't want to give Bibi any credit? But do you think if let's say the center, forget the left, there's no left in Israel anymore. Let's say a center party took over, there was a different prime minister. You think they would continue on this path of the Abraham Accords and trying to find other countries and really create more normalization with our neighbors here in the Middle East?
Yeah, I'm less concerned about a change here, because I think that what's been created is very hard to alter. It's very hard to move the clock back. Although I will say this: if there is a hostile American administration, then we're going to find less prescient and less courageous leadership here that's going to follow through and say, well, what can we do? This is the United States that's pressuring us. We have no choice. So look, I'm concerned about change. If we're talking about an entente, the relationship between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been one of great mutual respect, understanding, appreciation, and pretty much of the same mindset on so many issues. So any change in that is going to be a threat. But I think that right now, I'm most concerned about what's going to happen in 2 weeks in the elections in the US. Absolutely. Very concerned. I mean, it's not just about Joe Biden being president. It's about all the people that are going to be in key positions of influence, from the ambassador he appoints to Israel, to the Secretary of State that's going to come in. I mean, we could see, we can theoretically see, an Elizabeth Warren as Secretary of State or Secretary of the Economy. We can see a Bernie Sanders in a secretarial position, and Kamala Harris, is not a stalwart friend of Israel. So, and also, but again, it's more than just their attitude towards Israel. It's their attitude to the position of the United States in the world. If you don't fundamentally believe that the founding fathers created a country that is one step ahead and one step above and needs to lead because of the values that the United States has represented, then the world is in a very big problem because no, the systems of government in China and in Russia and so many countries around the world, particularly Turkey and Iran, they're not on equal footing. And if you some of the positions, some of their policies are fundamentally evil. And if evil is not opposed assertively, then it's going to gain an upper hand. So I'm immediately most concerned about what happens in the U.S. And I think everybody should make it a personal obligation to get out there and convince anybody who's debating what to do, just to put all the the feelings about Trump's personality aside. They're actually irrelevant, because you're not looking for a spouse. You're not looking for a tennis mate. You're looking for a president. And as far as the president's concerned, he can have a gruff manner, but the question is, what are the policies that he's implementing? The policies have been good for Israel and for the United States of America and for the world. And if we go back to a Obama-inspired world, we're going to be in rough shape. We're in for a rough time.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago about the journalist from Saudi Arabia who's saying, they're sitting on all these billions. Look, that didn't just come out last week. The corruption of the Palestinian Authority, the fact that Suwa Arafat is sitting in a mansion in Paris with money that was stolen from the people, right? It came into the Palestinian Authority, billions and billions of dollars, and the lives of the little people really weren't changed so much because their leadership just took so much of it and just said no to everything, and has really kept them in a very bad place for so long. But the atmosphere has changed in that they're willing to say it, Saudi Arabia and others. And they must have known for a long time. And that's what's really very fascinating about what's happening here, is that people are, what we knew 20 years ago, this is not a secret, but now people are talking about it openly. But some of the people who are writing in, some of our listeners are writing in, and some of the questions, and there seems to be a tremendous concern if Israel puts, to get back to the subject, if Israel putting sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, if we've stopped talking about a two-state solution, and virtually everybody has, then if we're talking about more of a one state, right? Does it mean that the Arabs here will get voting rights? There are people who are concerned that they'll get rights, let's say in East Jerusalem or out here, and just vote Israel out. I mean, we still have a problem, even though they're Israeli citizens, we have a problem with the Arab Israeli members of Knesset who voted against these accords. I mean, you would think they would be the first ones to say, this is phenomenal that we can have relationships with Arab countries in the Middle East, and they voted against. So there's so many mixed pieces happening here. Are you concerned about that? The Trump plan clearly states that Israel would put sovereignty on the areas, Area C, where the Jewish communities are, and leave the other areas in what kind of shape? If the PA is a non-functioning, corrupt regime. So what happens to the Arabs there? Meaning, somebody asked, so if we have good relationships with the Arabs here, how can we hang them out to dry, right? And leave them to live in like a kind of Lebanon under our noses, if you will, right? Shouldn't we bring them in as Israeli Arabs have been brought in to a westernized country? Yet what does that do to our demographics? And the fact that there still might be people among them who will use democracy in order to undermine Israel. So the sovereignty issue, as you're saying, has only been postponed, but there are many questions still about it that are making people quite nervous. So what are your feelings about that?
Well, the issue about the Arabs in Israel who are citizens and the Arabs in Judea and Samaria who are not is an issue whether or not we're talking about sovereignty. It's always been an issue. As a matter of fact, that was one of the key reasons. I mean, anybody takes a look at Tzipi Livni's speeches. That was her main brief. That if we don't give up Judea and Samaria, then we're going to have a binational state. Right. So, but that's simply misplaced policy and logic. It doesn't mean we're going to have a binational state, and nobody's advocating for. Well, I wouldn't say nobody. There are some on the more dogmatic right who say that, yes, we should apply citizenship to all the Arab
sovereignty to the
Palestinian Arabs. Yeah, sovereignty all over Judea and Samaria, and therefore give equal rights to all of our inhabitants, which we'd obviously have to do if we apply sovereignty to Shechem. Then all of Shechem become citizens of Israel. But that simply isn't going to happen. And there are this binary approach that we either make them all citizens of Israel or throw them out. Right. That's both of them are irrelevant. Those are options that are irrelevant. And there are many political options in between once we start thinking out of the box. What we need to focus on right now is economic growth and development. The Palestinian Authority has a law actually on the PA law books, which forbids the participation of Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria in the workforce, particularly in the settlements. And they can be fined up to $14,000 and jailed for 5 years. That's a law in the Palestinian Authority. And yet, because of popular sentiment, it's not implemented. And when they called on everybody to stop going in, the 150,000 that work in Israel proper, nobody stopped coming into work because that speaks a lot more than Abu Mazen's political machinations. If you take a look at all the industrial zones, despite the intifadas and despite the periods of violence, there is not a day where there isn't a full regimen of laborers coming in to work in these industrial zones. Because sending your kids to school and putting bread on the table and providing a future is not coming from the Palestinian Authority. It's coming from the industrial zones. So first, we need to focus on raising the standard of living, of taking some of the influence away from the Palestinian Authority de facto, not de jure, by creating industrial zones, by creating economic opportunities. I just presented at the conference today an idea for an international free trade and industrial zone in the Jordan Valley. Israel's been looking to build the Jordan Valley up for many years, and I took the concept of the Tennessee Valley and the millions of people who are lifted out of poverty because of that. I think the same kind of idea. Both Israel and Jordan have free trade agreements with the United States, and the United States is now looking desperately for new sources of products to offset imports from China. So we have a very unique opportunity here. I mean, if you take a look at textiles, for example, the United States imports $76 billion in textiles from China. Now, even if the Democrats come into power, they're looking to reduce that import dependency on China. So, and the Gulf states are looking also to invest. We create a free trade and industrial zone that can employ 250,000 people. I'm talking about a plan that sits on 16,000 square miles. So Israel benefits because the Jordan Valley becomes a source of economic development. We provide employment opportunities for Jordanians on the Jordanian side, for Palestinians and Israelis on this side, and it's a win-win situation for everybody involved. But in terms of the political opportunities that might emerge from that, there's a whole gamut of ideas. There's Professor Mordechai Kedar's idea, where there would be mini city-states. Ramallah would be separate and Shem would be separate without necessarily territorial continuity.
Like Emirates.
Like an Emirati case, the Emirati case. There's also the possibility of one of the things that we're exploring in the Shiloh Policy Forum is in order to prevent territorial contiguity, providing transportational contiguity, where obviously, depending on what the IDF deems permissible security-wise, but the ability for our population to transport from north to south without any without being impinged upon by roadblocks and travel restrictions and congestion and so on. So there are all sorts of ideas that could emerge, but nobody is going to advocate, granting citizenship, incorporating all this territory into Israel. There's autonomy, and there's city states, and there's federation with Jordan. There are a whole slew of options, but they're not going to emerge if we go back to talking about a two-state solution. If the Democrats come in and Biden says as Secretary of State to the Middle East, and the first thing he says is, we're going back to the two-state solution, well, then these other possibilities are going to take longer to emerge. Now we have the opportunity to have them emerge because the two-state solution, which isn't a solution at all, but a recipe for disaster, has been put on the back burner. So I'm very hopeful in that regard. We have to, keep focused, not lose our vision. It's going to be a rocky road. Okay, right. But it's been rocky in the past, and look how far we've come. We opened the discussion talking about where we were 35 years ago. Look where we are today. So we can expect a rocky road, but what we have to do is recommit ourselves to the values that are permanent and which ultimately are going to make a difference. So if anybody feels a sense of, an enervated sense of weakness and tiredness, just go back and see what's transpired over 30, 40 years. My biggest concern again is you remember the statement about Ben Gurion used to say, shmum, I don't care about what the Goyim think. I think of what the Jews do. I'm most concerned about what the Jews do, and we have a long history of creating golden calves. If we're able to stay away from quick fix solutions and the tired feeling of let's just fix this. We have a peace treaty now with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and it looks like Sudan and Saudi Arabia are down the pipe because we didn't look for quick fix solutions. They came to us without our establishing a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. They came to us with a prime minister who's talking about sovereignty in Judea and Samaria over all the Jewish communities. So we have to remember that, and that will enable us to keep firm and keep focused on what we've got to do.
Well, they came to us because we were strong in many ways when it comes to desalinating water, which there's always a tremendous dearth of in the Middle East, and natural gas, and a safe zone for importing things through the Mediterranean into their countries.
Jordan is the fourth country in the world suffering from water scarcity.
Yeah.
Okay. They are in desperate need of our assistance, and they know that we've become a water superpower. Right. I mean, you remember just a few years ago, it was 15, 20 years ago, where our time, the time we had to wash our hands and to take a shower and do the dishes was rationed. Yeah. And now we've become a net water exporter. You know that according to the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, we obligated to provide them with 50 million cubic square cubes of water. We've now doubled that to 100, right? Because of our water desalination project. 55% of our water today in Israel is processed water, is desalinated water. 87% of our agricultural, industrial water comes from recycled water. So recycled waste. So we have the potential. It's not only Jordan. It's the Palestinian Arabs. It's the Jordanians, and it's a lot of Western Saudi Arabia. Many villages are suffering there from water scarcity. We have the possibility of creating what are called infrastructure corridors, which can carry water, gas, natural gas, fuel, We could be sending gas from reservoirs in the Mediterranean to Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and they could be sending us in return through the very same pipes next to each other, fuel going to Europe and the United States. It can be piped straight through.
Do you think that, so we're talking about the countries that are already normalized with us, on the way. We've got a few hard nuts though to crack. We've got Hamas in Gaza. We have Lebanon just to the north of us. Let's leave Syria out of the picture for now because they're just imploding. Do you think what's happening now with these other Arab countries could give some kind of solution? Again, we don't need them to love us. We just need them to not want to wipe us off the map. That's okay also. With the tremendous crisis that Lebanon is in right now, of course, Hezbollah, having taken over the country, but what happened in Beirut and just really the collapse of Lebanon, Hamas and the awful things that are happening to the Gazans because of Hamas every single day. And they just shot a rocket, at Israel yesterday. It's like, we're still here. But do you think that there's any chance? I'm not going to talk about Iran and the real, crazy fanatics, although maybe Hamas could fit into that. I don't know. But do you think there's a chance that they're going to say, you know what, like we want to get into this also? Things aren't working out here for our people. We're not going to sign a peace accord with Israel, but we can do what apparently was done for the last decade with the UAE and Bahrain and just have quiet negotiations, businesses back and forth, without anything fancy signed, but just cooperation, and more important than that, a lack of violence, a lack of war? Or do you see, and those two particular neighbors, as just like there's nothing that's going to change those situations there? Might this also help our problems to the southeast, to southwest, and our problems to the north?
It all depends on us. If we're patient and steadfast, yes. Yes, yeah. If we're patient and steadfast, the answer is yes. If we succumb to, pressures or temporary infatuation with, with other ideas, then no.
Yeah. Then it'll still. So are you, nothing is more dangerous, as they say, as a cornered tiger, right? Anybody who feels like they've got nothing left to lose is just going to go all out there. Is what's happening with,
by the way, is the reason that's the way, and the reason why in the Torah we have an obligation when we go to war, yes, not to surround a city on its four sides, not because we have to leave one side open, not only because we have to give them an out, but because if they're completely encircled, they're going to fight like a tiger.
Fight to the death.
So you're absolutely right.
I mean, that happened in Jerusalem in 1967, accidentally, but that's exactly what happened. There was a corridor and the Jordanians fled the old city. But is it possible, though, that, let's say, if we put this in a Muslim sense, right, Shia versus Sunni, that you have Iran mainly is going to be so upset, even more upset, not just upset with Israel now, but of course upset with what looks like a betrayal, especially Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, if they sign with Israel, that looks like a major Muslim betrayal, to the Jews, even though they all hate each other. Do you think that makes them more dangerous, or that's impossible because they're already there? I mean, they're already a total existential threat, not just to Israel, but to a lot of the states around us here in the Middle East. Did this make that situation worse, or there was no way it could have been made worse? Or maybe it was made better by this?
No. If more Arab states sign on with Israel, then it's going to weaken them. Look, it's not. First of all, you have to understand it's not a Shia-Sunni divide. Turkey is Sunni and right. Iran is Shia. It's extremism. It's extremism, yeah. And extremism finds easy bosom buddies. And you have a situation where it's very clear that Iran is at the root of the civil war in Syria, is at the root of the instability in Lebanon. And you see, by the way, you mentioned Lebanon, throngs of Lebanese have had it up to their eyeballs with the Hezbollah. Where that's going, unclear. But I would say, without a doubt, that they've been strengthened. Those elements in Lebanon have been strengthened by the Accords, the Abraham Accords. But you see the destabilization that Iran has caused in Iraq, mentioned Syria, and Yemen. So
Right.
the Saudis look to their north, and they look to their south, and they look, to their east, and they say, hey, this, we're threatened. And as one of the commentators on the panel said today from Dubai, says, it wasn't Israel who fired missiles into Saudi Arabia.
Right.
It was the Iranian-backed Yemenites, and he gave a list of terrorist attacks that took place against Emiratis, and says, look, all of this is not Israel. This is these extremists. So no, I think that a deepening relationship with the Gulf states is going to isolate Iran more and more. What is going to be tragic is if a democratic administration comes in and reinstates the Iranian nuclear deal, which is going to send a message to the extremists in Yemen, to the extremists to Assad, to Erdogan in Turkey, to Hezbollah, and to Hamas, that they're back on the horse, and that's going to be a terrible, terrible tragedy.
So you mentioned Paraguay before. We need to wrap this up in a few minutes. That you were in Paraguay, and you're also very involved with Israeli technology, obviously political science. You understand the different players in a lot of the different arenas. Can you tell our viewers what it is that you're doing now, the company that you're working for, and how you're promoting Israel now in your way around the world?
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of stumbled upon Paraguay. A very dear friend of mine in Brazil asked if I was at the time I was teaching in law school in Ono, and he said, "Look, it's going to be intercession. Can you come down and advise a presidential candidate who's very pro-Israel?" And it's an amazing story. It's actually, some of the viewers may know Dr. Julio Messer, who's originally he was president of Likud for many, many years, and his father had been involved in business with a very a young man from Paraguay by the name of Horacio Cartes many years ago, and he was an 18-year-old kid in Paraguay, and he got connected with Mr. Messer in Rio de Janeiro, and he became very successful. He became a billionaire, and he was running for the presidency of Paraguay in 2000. Paraguay has a very mixed relationship with Israel. It was one of the first countries that actually recognized Israel in 1948, but then there was the Stroessner regime, which was a fascist regime, which permitted some Nazis to come in. Paraguay to this day has a very interesting Jewish community that's left, and a wonderful dear friend of mine who's the Chabad rabbi who keeps the community alive. Just an amazing, he and his wife are just amazing individuals. And I said to Dr. Messer, I'll fly down there for for consultation. And I guess the candidate liked what he heard. I gave him some interesting recommendations, and he ended up winning the election by 10%. When we first met, it was 4 months before the election. He was about on par with the opposition, and it was very interesting. With some of the advice that I gave him, I remember we were standing by the door of his palatial house, and I said, Horacio, this is going to be very trying for you if you try to implement this. He said, he has, it's very interesting, he has a Christian Bible by the entrance to his house. It's always open. And he said, you see that? He said that, Yechiel, the only thing I'm afraid of is God. He said, I get strength from the Jews. I get strength from the Israelis. And he says, don't worry, I'm okay. And immediately he returned the ambassador to Israel. He was the second country that moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, when he left office, his replacement moved it back to Tel Aviv, but it was he created a great friendship with Israel. But what I found was that Israel has so much to offer developing countries. There's so much talk about food security today, water security. And what's happening in Israel is that we have great companies, great technologies, but we don't present it in an integrated way. So if we were able to present a package to villages in many countries in Africa and South America, which took our advances in many, many different fields and said, this is how we can lift an entire population out of poverty, then that's really what I studied in Paraguay, how it could be done and how to go about doing it, and what really economic development could be had in these poorly developed countries. And I try to, create a package, and I consult on that basis. But my primary work right now is at the Kohelet Policy Forum and the Shiloh Policy Forum. Kohelet has been rated the most influential policy think tank in Israel today. It has half the budget of the Israel Democracy Institute, but it has twice the influence. As a matter of fact, our CEO was rated the 7th most influential person in Israel. So there's some 70 young, researchers, and we're presenting policy papers to the government on a weekly basis on a wide variety of fields, and making a really big difference. So right now, I've dedicated most of my time to the sovereignty issue and the a policy paper that we're going to be presenting in about 2 to 3 weeks' time, which is a completely new paradigm for dealing with the Palestinian issue in Israel. And I think it could make a tremendous difference in terms of how we relate to that issue and how we take the reins, the bull by the horns, and do what we have to do to ensure Israel's rights, Israel's security, and help the Palestinian Arabs to raise their economic profile, their quality of life, and have much far less dependency on the Palestinian Authority. And that will, in effect, create an alternative to the tired and failed paradigms that we've heard repeatedly for so many years.
So one last question, because you mentioned the former president of Paraguay and the Bible, and we've touched a little bit on idolatry, golden calves here and there. So not to get into a theological discussion, but a lot of what we talk about here in Israel, for many people, resonates as more than just a safe little Jewish country in which to live that desalinates water and is, helps our neighbors. It's a value way beyond. For many of us, including, I would say, the two of us, because we picked up from comfortable lives and made a conscious decision to come here a long time ago and raise children here. And the road, as you said before, has not always been an easy one. So the question repeatedly comes up is how much of that, I hate to use the word religious because it's way overused, but how much of that reason that we're here, the overriding mission of the Jewish people and the return to the land of Israel, how much of that do we put aside for practical, if you will, agreements with our neighbors? For example, the Temple Mount. There's this recurrent, whether it's a rumor or whatever it is, that especially if we are going to sign, I'm ending on a very easy question, aren't I, Phil? Especially if we're going to sign, let's say, with Saudi Arabia, that we're going to have to make concessions on our holiest site or on some of these places, some of which we've already given away. You mentioned Shechem before, Nablus. If you want to get to Joseph's tomb, it's going to take a whole army to get you there. It's not a simple thing. You lived in Hebron for a while. We can go to the tomb of the patriarchs now, thank God, easily, but Hebron is still not what we would like it to see. So this is really a personal question, not coming from a policy place or anything like that, of which you know way more than probably all of us listening collectively. Where are red lines when it comes to this? That idea of land versus the bigger picture here. This isn't just a country for many of us. This is a miracle. It's the culmination of thousands of years of yearning. It's a return home, and also a place, where any Jews will find haven should things get really rough in other parts of the world. There's a lot in this little piece of property that's more than just the trade agreements and the oil pipelines, etc. So what do you answer, or even to your kids? I don't know if I'm sure this comes up around your dining room table like it comes up around mine. None of Israeli children are not known for their reticence in many matters. So like to end on a personal note, if you will, if you don't mind sharing, what do you feel about this mifal, the Hebrew word, the English is escaping me, called Israel.
So this is the tell me the whole Torah standing on one foot question.
Something like that.
Something like that. We have to leave something for Mashiach to do. We don't want him to come and for him to be unemployed. Okay, the expectation that
tour guide, yes.
Well, the expectation that everything is going to be neatly put into place and we're going to go about our daily lives without any challenges and hassles and confrontations, and it's not in this life. And we have to do our best to prepare for the era when that'll be the case, but I don't think we can really expect it. What are the red lines? I know it when I see it. I don't think there are any general rules to that.
Mm-hmm.
Judaism is not opposed to realpolitik. The notion that we just get up on our high horse and wave the chumash, it never worked that way. Not from the time of Avraham Avinu, from the time of our forefathers and matriarchs. It just doesn't work that way. As a matter of fact, God himself says to Moses, right? What is the paragon of Jewish identity, if not the Exodus from Egypt, right? Everything is the Exodus from Egypt. Shabbat is the Exodus from Egypt. All our holidays are the Exodus from Egypt. We repeat it twice in the Shema every day. Exodus from Egypt is the key. And what does God say to Moses when he sends him to Pharaoh? He says, tell him we want to go for a 3-day holiday in the desert.
Right.
Now, that wasn't God's intention, right? But he knew that Moshe Rabbeinu had to appeal to two audiences. One audience was Pharaoh, but the other audience was the Jewish people. If we would have gone back and said, we're out of here, they would have thrown him out of there. You had to get them, it was a process. You had to get them ready. You had to bring them in. You had to, I would refer the listeners to the wonderful commentary of the Ibn Ezra on the portions of the Torah that deal with the time before leaving Egypt, and how he emphasizes the need to change the mindset of the Jewish people from a slave mindset to a free people mindset. It took time, and look what happened as soon as we left. I mean, we turned our backs on the splitting of the Red Sea, and we spent 40 years whining, right? I mean, anybody just has to open up the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, and see every single weekly portion is we're doing something else we shouldn't be doing, or at least segments of the population. I mean, it was one trial and tribulation after another. And yet at the end of the day, we reached the promised land. So there's going to be a rough ride, and not everything is done yet. And, it leaves us a lot to do. If we want, Mashiach to come and be happy and not be unemployed, we have to do ours first. And we still have a lot to do. So let's focus on what we have to do. And when we see those red lines, we'll know it, and we'll hold firm and with persistence and courage, and do what we have to do. But not hurry the day, because it's there's a cadence to Jewish history, and we see the experiences of the past 30, 40 years. We see what we've done since the 60th War. We see that all of Israel's a process. 1948, we didn't liberate Jerusalem. It took 19 years. We didn't liberate Hebron and Beit El and Shiloh and Shem. It took longer, and we didn't immediately go and settle 500,000 Jews in Israel's homeland, in the center of our heartland. It took time. It took 5 decades, and we're still working on it. So Let's do what we have to do and not be too alarmed by the obstacles along the way. We just got to get beyond them.
Okay. Dr. Yechiel Leiter, thank you so much for sharing just a little bit of your vast experience and knowledge. Most of us don't even come close to doing for the state of Israel what you have done. I want to wish you many more years of working very hard for this country and for everything that you and I and so many of the people watching hold dear. And to thank you again for being the founder of One Israel Fund, because we're continuing also every single day to make sure that there's no reason ever for anybody to ever want to leave Judea and Samaria, and many reasons to want to come and strengthen this place and strengthen the Middle East by doing so.
Well,
So thank you so
Eve,
much.
thank you very much, and to the directors of the One Israel Fund for having me. I wish you, of course, the best of luck. You're doing great work. Continue to do great work, and to all the donors. Look, the only excuse you have
Really
not to
doesn't happen.
the only reason you have not to double and triple your support for One Israel Fund is if you actually pick up and buy a house in Efrat or in Eli. Until that time, please continue to support the wonderful work of One Israel and Eve. And thank you very much once again for the time and for the opportunity to share some thoughts.
Thank you. And please send the link to the policy, the forum that you mentioned that happened today, and we will send it out because you definitely piqued everybody's curiosity, and we'll send it out to everyone who views it. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This will be within about 24 hours or so on our site, oneisraelfund.org, and also on the Facebook page. So, and it will be sent out and available for anybody to see if they didn't make it live. Thank you once again, Dr.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye-bye. Shalom, and everybody, wherever you are, just be well. Eve Harow, thanks again. Bye-bye.